Good to be with you. I'm Frances Rivera. We are following live coverage of President Trump's historic two-day summit in China. President Trump and Chinese President Xi arriving at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. There you see a live look there at the president addressing reporters. This follows their high-stakes meeting at the Great Hall of People. We heard from both leaders before they went behind closed doors for just over 2 hours. President Trump addressing President Xi at the top of that meeting, saying he's a great leader and that the arrival ceremony was, quote, an honor like few I've ever seen before. President Trump adding he looks forward to a big discussion on trade and business and says the U.S.'s relationship with China will be better than ever. Also, Chinese state media reporting that Taiwan is the most important issue to China, with Xi warning Trump that if Taiwan is not handled well, U.S. China relations will be pushed to a dangerous place, in his words. Also, with President Trump in Beijing, over a dozen American CEOs, including the heads of Tesla, NVIDIA, and Apple, as he looks to get China to open up to American businesses. As the president makes his way to the stairs of the Temple of Heaven, I want to bring in NBC News chief White House correspondent Garrett Haake, who is in Beijing. And Garrett, as we take a look at these pictures of the two leaders here after their meeting, high-stakes meeting earlier, we saw the pomp and circumstance, the pageantry of his welcome ceremony, and the warm tone of their remarks at the start of the meeting before they went behind closed doors. But what's important is what happened behind those closed doors in those 2 hours.
Yeah, that's right, Francis. And really, we only know about that behind closed doors portion from Chinese state media at this point. As you laid out, the Chinese were very quick to say that they believe Taiwan is the most important issue between the U.S. and China. That's notable given the fact that when President Trump last met with President Xi, the president said Taiwan did not come up at all. Clearly not the case today, with Xi warning President Trump that this is an issue that could ultimately lead to conflict. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs describes the Taiwan issue like this. They say if the Chinese were arming a U.S. state that wanted to secede, we wouldn't tolerate that in America. Why should the Chinese tolerate the U.S. position in providing arms to Taiwan? It is a deeply personal issue on the Chinese side. Likewise, another apparent warning from Xi to President Trump, according to Chinese state media, about trade, reminding President Trump that there are no winners in a trade war. Again, and this is another area in which the circumstances have changed dramatically since their last meeting last fall, where there was the tit-for-tat raising and lowering of tariffs that had taken place between the two nations, some rare earth export controls that ultimately forced the president to change his position. Now the temperatures have cooled on that front. The president has fewer levers at his disposal to unilaterally add tariffs back to China, but clearly still in the mind of the Chinese that the economic relationship needs to continue to work smoothly. And we just add that President Trump had made it clear in the lead up to this summit. Speaking briefly now, it doesn't look like we're going to hear from the president, but he had made it clear in the lead up to this summit that in the president's view, trade was the most important issue he wanted to discuss. He said that would be the first thing he brought up with President Xi. He wants to see China's markets opened, something Western leaders have wanted for more than 200 years, Francis.
Garrett, and we are hearing that the president did not answer any questions there when he was meeting with his reporters before stepping up to the stairs of the Temple of Heaven. He didn't take questions, but he did say the meeting went great. And that's the thing here when we're looking at these meetings and the asks on both sides when it comes to Taiwan, trade, Iran, and what it'll take for it to be victorious on either side. What's a win for the U.S. and what's a win for China?
Well, a win for China is stability, essentially. The Chinese system is built on stability, both domestically and internationally. They don't want to see drama with the United States. They want to continue to export goods to the United States. They would like to see the U.S. war with Iran wrapped up expeditiously. Iran is an important Chinese trading partner, has been for hundreds of years. They get a significant amount of their energy through the Strait of Hormuz, either from Iran directly or from other Gulf countries who use that strait. The Chinese have been critical of the war. Likewise, President Trump wants to see that war wrapped up, depending on sort of when you talk to him about it. He has suggested that he might lean on President Xi to try to use the Chinese influence with Iran to get them back to the negotiating table in a meaningful way to end this war. For the president, as I said, it's about trade. It's about finding more markets for U.S. goods. He has with him some top CEOs, both from the tech industry, but also from the agricultural industries. He wants to see China become a major purchaser, an importer of U.S.-made goods to fix a trade imbalance between the two countries that he's been complaining about since the 1980s. Now, from the Chinese perspective, it seems unlikely they will dramatically change their policies around trade, but if there is some kind of token announcements, maybe the Chinese are going to buy more Boeing aircraft, maybe they're going to buy more U.S. agricultural goods. Those are the kind of things that can keep what is the most important bilateral relationship in the world going. And finally, Francis, I'll just add that it can sound kind of small to talk about the personal relationships between these two leaders as a major takeaway, but in China, given the amount of power that is vested in Xi Jinping, who's been the leader of China for 13 years now, the personal relationship and the personal rapport is particularly important. These are two leaders who like to act unilaterally, and the fact that they get along and have an open line of communication is important to the world, frankly.
Yeah, and President Trump spoke of that before this meeting, saying they have a fantastic relationship, even saying that, talking off the cuff, that when they do have problems, issues, they get on the phone, they talk to each other. It's what the people, what the world doesn't see, but they do have that kind of relationship. As we take a look at them there at the Temple of Heaven, I want to ask you, you brought up the topic of Iran, and that's what we really are curious when we can ask the president at this point questions about Iran, how much they delved into it, because of the mixed messaging from the president before he left on this trip. Said that it was going to be high on the agenda with these talks, but also saying that, you know what, it's going to be long talks. Iran may not be one of the topics, in his words, saying we kind of got this. We got this under control.
Well, look, the president has consistently projected optimism that Iran is an issue that's under control or that a deal might be close, but he's been saying that for weeks now, and no deal has materialized. The U.S. has clearly tried several different options to bring Iran back to the negotiating table since the ceasefire was declared last month, whether it was the blockade, whether it was the attempt to protect ships transiting through the strait. None has really, in the big picture, changed Iran's position on the war. China has levers at their disposal if they choose to use them. They are an enormous purchaser of Iran's oil. Estimates vary anywhere from 60 to 80%. A lot of it is off books to avoid sanctions, so it's hard to know exactly how much oil they're purchasing. But they have an economic relationship with Iran that's hundreds of years old. And when the ceasefire itself was announced last month, all parties credited China for working behind the scenes to try to help that take place. Could the president ask Xi Jinping for more help in that regard? Would the Chinese be willing to put some strain on their relationship with Iran to try to move things along? Or is there kind of a Goldilocks option here where China could be a key mediator or a key interlocutor somehow on the nuclear issue, which is the most sensitive? All of those, I think, are open questions, and we will hope to find out whether they came up in this meeting or will at some point in this continued engagement now through tomorrow.
Yeah, at the point where the president will share what was discussed, as he did not when he addressed reporters as he arrived there at the Temple of Heaven. All right, Garrett, hang with me as we bring in NBC's Brian Cheung. And Brian, you and I have both been to the Temple of Heaven, but I'm not even going to start to delve into it. You're the expert when it comes to this, and especially when it comes to trade. We'll get to that too. But first, tell us what they're doing, what they're seeing inside as this cultural visit continues there at the Temple of Heaven.
Yeah, well, as it happens, I've been to Beijing a number of times, and the Temple of Heaven is a very common stop for a lot of tourists that are visiting Beijing, in addition to the Forbidden City. I think that the Forbidden City is probably what most people think about, but believe it or not, people might be surprised to find out that the Temple of Heaven complex is actually larger in size than the Forbidden City. You're seeing those images on the screen of what the inside of the temple looks like. I don't believe we're going to get images of President Xi Jinping and President Trump inside of that temple, even though we got them standing at the stairs going up into the Temple of Heaven. You can see those beautiful reds and blues and greens, teals inside of the Temple of Heaven. This area is a very sacred area, and I think that in the way that the Forbidden City kind of represents a lot of kind of the history of China from a state standpoint, this is a little bit more of a spiritual place. This is where the emperors during the Ming and Qing dynasties used to make sacrifices in this complex as a way to kind of liaise between the earthly side of reality and the heavens, and kind of liaising with the gods. There's a circular mound altar which is on a different complex at Temple of Heaven, where it's a big open space. There's not an actual structure on top, but it kind of represents these areas where the emperors would make these sacrifices. And I think that the metaphors cannot be lost, that as these two massive giants in the political landscape of global politics are meeting, that sacrifices will have to be made, especially on the trade front. When you consider that if the United States wants to walk away with, with China buying Boeing airplanes or agricultural products, as Garrett was just laying out, well, then the United States is going to have to give up something too. What does that look like? Does that look like a commitment to not re-raising tariffs on China to levels that we saw last year? Would it be some concession on Taiwan? I think that it might be very intentional on the Chinese part to bring President Trump to this particular complex for that reason. And again, I think that the grandeur of what we're seeing in terms of these images is a little bit more than just pretty images. There's a little bit of a deeper meaning to it as well, Francis.
As well as the symbolism, and adding metaphorically to that too. You know, this is also a place where the emperors would come and pray for a great harvest. And again, metaphorically, we're seeing that's the hopes of coming out of these meetings with deals being made too. And on that, you know, we saw the delegation of these top business leaders, these CEOs, who we did get some response from them when they were leaving the Great Hall, and with a thumbs up from, I believe that was Tim Cook, Apple CEO, Elon Musk saying, you know, it went great, things went well so far. So, you know, there's also this goal here of opening up China when it comes to American businesses.
Yeah, and you know, we're getting kind of bits and pieces from the pool, which managed to shout some questions at Elon Musk and Jensen Huang. Tim Cook, as they were leaving the Great Hall of the People, which is where we originally saw that meeting that you see on the screen ahead of you a few hours ago. Apparently, Musk said that those talks were wonderful. Jensen Huang, again, CEO of NVIDIA, said that the meetings went well. But we're also getting a readout from the Chinese state media, Xinhua, which, again, is usually kind of the mouthpiece of what's going on inside there in lieu of any official communications from, let's say, the Ministry of Foreign Relations of China itself. And they said that President Xi Jinping did meet with American business leaders at some point. We didn't necessarily see those images directly, but according to Xinhua, Xi Jinping told these American companies that China's door to opening up will only open wider. That, according to the translation that we saw of what Xinhua had posted online in Chinese. Moreover, apparently Xi Jinping told these American companies that they will, quote, have broader prospects in China. So that does point to some willingness, at least some warm reception from the Chinese in terms of giving these American companies something that they'll be able to return to the United States with in terms of more business prospects in China. Again, what does that look like? That remains to be seen. Some of that could be posturing. We haven't heard from the American side what the nature of those conversations were like. But again, it does seem like, at least from the initial few minutes and hours of these meetings, that China appears to be open to giving American businesses at least some more market opportunity, if you will, in China.
Yeah, and also the push and the urgency from the president himself, right, especially when it comes to the CEO of NVIDIA. He was, the last company head to announce he was joining the summit. The president stopping in Alaska to refuel, and he hops on, saying, "Let's go. You're coming with us." Yeah. So when it comes to that, how is AI playing into the agenda for Trump and Xi, AI chips, and how that will come into play?
Yeah, a very dramatic scene with Jensen Huang jumping onto Air Force One at Anchorage's airport after a last-minute call from the president, a source familiar telling me that it was President Trump that reached out to Jensen Huang last minute and had him, at his request, meet Air Force One in Anchorage. Now, NVIDIA is really important here because when you talk about artificial intelligence, that is where these two massive superpowers, of course, the two largest economies in the world, they've always been competing, but artificial intelligence is a conversation that really did not exist the last time President Trump visited China in 2017. I mean, this has been a very fast emerging technology. You've seen the likes of DeepSeek on the Chinese side really giving American companies like OpenAI, Meta, Google a run for their money. And of course, what is the brain behind all of that artificial intelligence? It is these super smart chips, and NVIDIA makes arguably the best of them all. And for a long time, they've been facing these export controls that has prohibited prohibited NVIDIA from selling those high-power chips to China. Jensen Huang would love to sell some of those high-power chips to China, but there are national security interests on the United States side that have precluded them from doing so. So Jensen Huang joining on this trip is very much going to be a significant undertone to this negotiation between the U.S. and China. Is the U.S. and China open to cooperating, or will the national security interests that the United States has articulated in the past prevent that business relationship from growing from here? So I think that that's going to be a very, very interesting sub-thread to follow. The United States has seemed like they'd be open to letting NVIDIA sell chips. They are currently allowing the company to sell some of their not as high-power chips to China on the premise that they'll give 15% of that commission back to the U.S. But again, we'll have to see what comes of all this.
Yeah, it's an indicator. Jensen Huang said the meeting went well, but again, that was early on. All right. Thank you for being with me for now. I know you're going to stand by a little bit as we turn to Mark Stewart, former Beijing correspondent and global business strategist. He just wrapped up a 2-year assignment covering China. So, Mark, I appreciate your time with us this early hour. Let's talk about this, what you're watching, what you're looking for. We know initially off the top that President Xi did say that Taiwan is paramount among other issues, trade, Iran, although we're still waiting to hear from the president. What else are you looking for at this moment?
Yeah, hi there, Francis. It's good to see you. Look, it's just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Beijing. And typically what happens after a state visit such as this, we'll get a pretty quick indication from Beijing as to how it viewed its success. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs usually fairly quickly will provide some kind of readout about what transpired and what some of the remarks were said. One thing which Garrett Haake pointed out earlier, we heard Xi Jinping talk about the need for win-win agreements, mutually beneficial resolutions to some of these issues. That is language that we will hear from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also likely from Xi Jinping himself. There is a lot of consistency in word choice and messaging from Xi Jinping all the way to these statements, much different than the Trump White House, where some remarks you could say are a little bit more candid, a little bit more flippant, not necessarily consistent. So we'll get a readout fairly soon. If there were some areas of disagreement, it would be using language to the effect of, we implore the United States, or we urge the United States to do this, do that, or see this particular issue in a particular way. The other thing which I'm real curious to see is if the Ministry of Foreign Affairs holds a daily press briefing. Typically, every day at 3 p.m. local time in Beijing, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will provide a spokesperson to answer reporter questions. And every reporter who is in the room, if they have a question, they will get an answer. It may not be to the degree of specificity or detail that they hope, but questions are answered. Not clear if that's going to happen with such a big visit as is happening today. Also interesting to note that unlike the United States, where we see reporters throwing questions to President Trump all at the time and getting a response, that is not something Xi Jinping does. It is just not in the Chinese protocol. So if there are some details in the room that China is not releasing, perhaps these are responses that would come from President Trump. But this kind of Q&A that we see with the American president is not something we see in a leader such as Xi Jinping. Finally, Francis, I should say, the response from Chinese state media, which is very much the messenger service for the Chinese government, appears to be very positive. As you mentioned, there are going to be some contentious issues that will come up in these conversations, such as Taiwan, such as trade. There has been reporting that Xi Jinping made statements to the effect of, while there may be differences, the interests, the greater interest, the greater good is much stronger between these two leaders, Francis.
All right, Mark, let's talk about this, considering China, the state of China now, the economic struggles, youth unemployment, and weak consumer demand. How is that being addressed when it comes to Chinese citizens? What are they looking for out of this summit?
Well, right now, having been on the ground in China, morale has been tough. It's very difficult for young people to face jobs. The real estate market there has had a lot of strife, and that has impacted other industries such as retail, such as transportation. The hope is that there will be trade agreements that will benefit both nations. The reason perhaps why this meeting is taking place right now is the fact that in the end, we will see Xi Jinping and Donald Trump signing agreements together, indicating some kind of potential economic success for both nations. With all of that said, China, though, is very much acting on its own. It's trying to increase domestic production and domestic consumption of its products. I remember when the trade war was just breaking out, I was talking to a Chinese man who said, "Are you concerned?" And I asked him, "Are you concerned that you may not be able to get this American product that you like in China?" And his response was, "Well, China will be able to make it on its own." So China is very much trying to jumpstart its own economy in its own way. Yet at the same time, even though there has been this trade friction with the United States, China's been looking to other places to increase trade, such as in Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, to make it clear that it's not necessarily dependent on the United States. But if there is any similarity in the struggle between the United States and in China, it's the fact that citizens in both nations are feeling some economic hardship.
And we see that, we're hearing that, and also when it comes to President Xi in his opening remarks before this closed-door meeting, as we're taking a look at video from those remarks from President Trump said that this may be the biggest summit ever. And President Xi saying that we should be partners when it comes to U.S. relations, not rivals, not opponents. And so in looking at this at the start of this summit, what would you anticipate as far as the first steps in building that with those strong words of saying we should be partners and not rivals?
Well, there are some easy things that could take place. So, for example, we have all of these CEOs on this trip. So, as has been mentioned earlier, it's quite possible that we will see China make some commitment for new Boeing aircraft. It's quite possible that we will see China commit to buying more American soybeans. Soybeans are a key commodity, very important to the Chinese economy, yet China is not necessarily able to produce at the volume it needs. Soybeans are what are fed to pigs in China, and the pork market, the commodity market of pork is very important to China and its economic well-being. So we may see some announcements like that. This is not going to be, though, an economic free-for-all. China also is going to want to appear strong. It's at a point right now where it is trying to tell the world that there is an alternative view. It's almost trying to lead a new world order to make it clear that the world doesn't necessarily need the United States. But look, China is the world's second largest economy. The United States is the world's largest economy. There are more than 1 billion people in China. American companies want to be there. And it's also interesting, we have now seen Chinese companies try to make their way to the United States in some very subtle ways. Here in New York City, we've seen Luckin Coffee, a Chinese brand, open up in Manhattan. We've talked about, as silly as it is, these Labubu stuffed animal dolls. These are Chinese products, but are now very popular among young people in the United States. This is not just a cultural shift, but it has great economic potential for China. So both nations are going to want to see this reciprocal action to continue.
Looking ahead, as both presidents have a state banquet tonight as well as tomorrow at tea and also a working lunch. What will you be looking for from both of them as the summit continues?
Well, I think especially from China, government leaders there just want to make sure this stays to script and that there are no offhand remarks or any any remarks, especially from the U.S. president, in front of the press. We've seen in the Oval Office how tensions can erupt. This is something that China is going to want to avoid. As long as this stays scripted, China will be very happy about this. In addition, these banquets are a sight to see. They are grand. They are full of pomp and circumstance, music and performance. They are breathtaking. For China to say that it hosted the American president and put on such a grand show is going to have some high symbolic value among some of its supporters, including the government of India in many cases, and of course, Russia, Iran, as well as North Korea. So this is a moment for China to show strength.
And speaking of that symbolism, Mark, as we thank you for that insight and continue our conversation with Garrett Haake, there is that symbolism, but very much so, we're looking at symbolism in this summit, Garrett, but also very much so the substance that's going to come out of it, too.
That's right, and we've really only heard the most bare bones description of that substance, all of it coming from the Chinese side with their warnings about the dangers of tariffs and over the possible conflict that could arise over the strait between China and Taiwan. China's obvious desire for reunification with Taiwan, not something that sits well with U.S. interests. It's something that the president says they avoided discussing when the two leaders met in Busan last year, clearly not avoided today. As for what else happened behind the closed doors, we're going to have to wait and find out. There are interviews happening today and tomorrow with some of the cabinet officials with whom the president traveled to China. We know the meeting lasted about 2 hours and 15 minutes. That's 35 minutes or so longer than the last meeting between these two leaders in Busan last year. Sometimes that length matters, sometimes it doesn't. We covered plenty of these summits in which long meetings produce little results. But to Mark's point, the Chinese don't come into these summits unprepared or without an idea of what they want to discuss. Everything is tightly scripted, tightly organized, from the closed-door discussions where President Xi can be seen with a binder, essentially, of talking points in front of him as that meeting begins, to the pageantry itself. The show here puts on a message that is closely in line with the message that China wants to send to the world politically, that things are under control, that they are stable, to the idea of kind of a new world order that Mark was speaking about. China wants to present itself to the world at all times as a stable trading partner and partner in all things, and perhaps even a stable alternative to the United States. So the idea that all of these individual elements, so tightly scripted, go off without a hitch is part of the political messaging, whether it's done by President Xi speaking in a closed-door meeting or whether it's done with children holding flowers or military officers appearing in parade formation. It all works from the Chinese side. And they have, just as a sort of another bit of analysis here, taken an interesting tack by being kind of the first into the information space. Of course, it's the middle of the night in the United States, but right now we know so much more about how the Chinese view this brief first contact, if you will, today with the president than we do about how American officials review it. Now, that'll change by, breakfast television time in the United States, but it's certainly not the case now with the world watching this meeting so closely.
And as we're watching now, where will those opportunities be, given that there is that state banquet later today? Garrett, give us a rundown of the day and those opportunities for more deal making and for President Trump to share with us and the American people how productive these meetings have been.
That's right. I mean, the pool reporters indicated that President Xi did speak with some of the American business leaders around the time of this closed-door meeting, although not perhaps directly in it. The president now will go back to his hotel for a little bit of a break before this state banquet tonight. Then there are those additional meetings tomorrow, a ceremonial tea, another conversation between the two leaders. And we'll start hearing from some of those cabinet secretaries. Secretary Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, sitting down with our own Tom Yamas. That interview will appear on Nightly News tonight, as you see it there in the United States, tomorrow night as it would be here in Beijing. Likewise, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, sitting down with CNBC. We will start to see these American officials flood the zone and push the American viewpoint out of these meetings. As is often the case in these summits, although not always, we will sometimes get readouts from the White House about what we would call deliverables. Often these are things that are negotiated in advance and can be announced together. There's no sign that there'll be a joint press conference or a joint statement by these leaders. So it may just come out from the president's social media, followed by a paper statement from the White House that China has agreed to buy X number of airplanes or soybeans or the like. But again, typically a lot of those things are agreed to in advance, and so that both leaders can kind of take advantage of all the attention that the summit provides to make those announcements to their own domestic audiences.
And when those headlines are made, you'll be there to bring it to us. Chief White House Correspondent Garrett Haake, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much. So good night, good afternoon to you, Garrett. And of course, we'll have much more on the president's China summit throughout the day on NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com, and a full wrap up on today.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.